roadmap to
oh, that was loud.
Oh, that's new.
Okay, so breakdown to breakthrough, a roadmap of trauma care, and we're really going to be looking at post-traumatic growth. And I mean, we've already had quite a lot of discussions about trauma, about burnout with CCH, CoCreate Humanity, and so today we're really going to start looking at personal stories. We've kind of given it a very personal touch today. So this is my second webinar for CoCreate Humanity. My first one was on psychologically safe management. So some of you may have met me there or in other areas. And why do I enjoy working with trauma so much? I mean, it's a good question. And I find that, you know, and I'm going to share my own story of post-traumatic growth as well as Helen and Christoph during the presentation. But, you know, I find that when people really have these experiences and they come out the other side and they've processed these experiences, they want to use that experience to help others. And so that kind of makes me feel really passionate about working with trauma and how we use those experiences to help others and to grow. So yes, so Christoph said we're going to do an hour presentation. There's going to be some music, there's going to be some videos and me talking, and others will come in, and then we'll record that, and then the second half we can have more of a personal discussion, and you can ask lots and lots of questions while you've got me here, make the most of it, and that bit isn't going to be recorded, so that's fine. Okay, shall I load up my slides? That's probably the best thing to do. And you'll get a copy of these as well. Okay, so is that working for everybody? Great, because once I start showing these, I can't actually see you all. So it's kind of a little bit like talking to my screen, but I'll try and keep it interactive and engaging as we go along. So from breakdown to breakthrough, through the lens of trauma, I suppose. Okay, so let me just... There we go. So I'm going to cover a very short introduction to myself, because most of you probably heard of me by now. We're going to look at the many faces of trauma and different types of traumatic events. In the psychological world, we refer to big T and little t. I don't personally like that term, but I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we're going to follow with personal stories of post-traumatic growth and look at the impact of collective trauma, some of the trauma therapy models, and those processing trauma case studies, and then just an overview of what organisations should have in place for a trauma management programme, you know, the ideal scenario. And I'm just adding in there lessons learned from COVID, because actually it's been quite interesting, particularly around trauma, some of the things that have come out through this. And then we're going to end on the scars of wisdom. So again, taken from personal stories. So just a little bit about myself. I'm FD, I'm Fiona Dunkley. I'm the founder of FD Consultants. We're a network of over 50 associates. We live and work globally. We specialise in trauma care. Most of our client organisations are within the humanitarian sector. We also work with mental health charities and emergency first responders. So we kind of do the preventative, the treatment and the rehabilitation. We offer lots and lots of workshops and crisis incident response. We've done lots of presentations and been presented on various radio and TV and global conferences. Just very briefly, I've published 2 books. One of them you've probably heard of, Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Aid Workers. That was published in 2018, and it's full of personal case studies of individuals that work in the sector, including Christoph's. It's also a trauma guide to organisations and to individuals. So it's helping us to become trauma informed, and the importance of that, I think, with working within this sector. Molly and the Two Pigeons was something I wrote this year to support me through lockdown. It's a children's story, and it's to help children understand coronavirus in a fun and light-hearted way. So if you search me, you'll see those. So we're going to start with a poll. So actually, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to get Christoph to share these 3 questions. Have you experienced the direct impact of trauma? Have you experienced the indirect impact of trauma? So then we're talking about the direct and then the indirect vicarious trauma impact. Or do you know someone close to you that's been impacted by trauma? So I'm going to just stop sharing these because I think we need to do that to do the poll. Christoph, I believe you put the link in the chats. Is that correct? It's at the top of the chat.
Okay. Yes.
It's anonymous.
Okay. What I will do. It's an anonymous poll. It will just be a yes and a no question. It will add up how many people voted, but nothing more than that. You don't need to log in or anything. And what I will do, I will just go back here and copy that link again. And I will, on my side, activate the poll. So you will see question number 1, and then question number 2, and question number 3. And then I'll go back and we'll look at the answers. So let me just go back. All right. So we're on.
So if you click on the link, there'll be 3 questions. Answer those. They take a little while to come in. I don't know that each one waits for us to complete it till you.
Yeah, I can see how many so far. We have 5 people, 6 people, 7. So we all together, we had 10 if I don't vote. So, and if you don't vote, so we're there. So I'm going to go now to the next one, number 2. Okay. And I'm going to go to the 3rd question.
And once you've done all 3, you can close down that window because Christoph will bring up the results separately through the through Zoom.
Okay. So now I will try to find the results. And I will share my screen. All right, so that's question number 1.
100%.
So 100%, all of you. Question number 2.
100%. Yep.
And that's question number 3.
I can't actually see the end one. What percentage does that say?
Okay, it's 87.5%
right.
For yes and 12.5% for no.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, you can take that off now. That's great. But I
Okay.
mean, the point I'm making here is that, you know, being impacted by trauma is common, and particularly if we work in the sector or in any kind of caring role. So, you know, 100% have been personally impacted directly and indirectly. And then no others is also still high. So I'm just going to bring the slides back on for you. So the point we're making is that, you know, this is common. And it happens to a lot of people. And there's a really excellent TED talk. If no one's seen it, do look at this, by Rolf Carrier. He's an economist. He's worked for the UN, UNICEF and World Bank, and it's in the references. So you will get a copy of these slides. Everything I'm showing today will be in the references. But he talks about the volume of trauma globally, the impact of us globally through trauma. And so he mentions here 1.5 billion people worldwide live in situations of political and criminal violence. So that can lead us to feel traumatized. 42 million people worldwide are either refugees or internally displaced people. And displacement is a big risk factor for trauma, for experiencing trauma. 200 million people exposed to natural disasters, and this is in 2011 alone. And we know this is becoming an annual feature with global climate change. 1.3 billion people living in absolute poverty. 1 in every 3 women worldwide suffer during their lifetime from sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. Most of these traumas, so most of these traumas he's talking about here are the kind of what we would suggest as big T events. But then he also adds all the little T events, which might be accidents, bullying, child abuse, difficult relationship separation, and that will affect millions and millions of people. So what he's saying is that the big T and the little t, it equals a staggering global burden of traumas. And we're not saying that everyone suffers from PTSD, most people don't. But the average life prevalence of people with PTSD is about 7 to 8%. So that's taken from statistics from the US. And so when he added all this up as an economist, he said there's at least 500 million cases of PTSD globally. And we know that actually it's probably unreported in a lot of areas within the world. And he talks about EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, but you can have a look at his TED talk, and trauma-focused CBT. Those are the 2 approaches that are recommended by WHO and APA and the NICE guidelines for trauma models of therapy that get really good results, and we use those at FD Consultants. So what we're saying is it's common, it happens to a lot of people, and actually I think the research and quoted in my book as well is that within the humanitarian aid sector, it's generally quoted about 30% of staff experience post-traumatic stress disorder during their career within the sector. That's really high. If if the average is 5 to 6% for the population, then that's really high. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the organizations need to become trauma informed. We all need to become trauma informed. We need to take responsibility as well to become trauma informed, so that we support people and we're not re-traumatizing people. And I'll talk a lot more about that through the personal stories that we're going to share. And thank you, Helen, for some of the graphics in here today. You'll recognise them. Yes, so and not only when we talk about trauma, we're not just talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. There's many faces of trauma. So if you look at the diagnostic manual, post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't added until the 1980s. Vicarious trauma has only been added just over 5 years ago. And organisations are becoming a little bit more tuned in to what is vicarious trauma. So that's the indirect impact of trauma. And then we've got acute stress disorder. So that's kind of what people would suffer for in the first 4 weeks. And then often PTSD isn't diagnosed until someone's had those symptoms for at least 4 weeks or more. We know that actually 30% of people experience a delayed trauma response. So often when I'm talking about trauma care, I talk about follow-up, check in with people, check in 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, because we may have a delayed trauma response. So even if someone's saying they're fine, they may not be fine further down the line. We talk about traumatic grief. It's different than the grieving process. So that's sudden death. That's when someone takes their own life, or perhaps even through the pandemic, the circumstances of not being able to be with your loved ones, and the short time period of someone passing away. So that creates that trauma response. And often what we find as trauma therapists is that we have to process the trauma first before the individual can start the grieving process. So actually general bereavement counselling may not be the best way of supporting yourself, because there may be this shock, the trauma response might need to be processed first. We talk about developmental trauma as well. So that's, you know, child abuse, a history of trauma, that cumulative impact. It could be neglect, mental abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, could be bullying. And we talk about intergenerational trauma, and there was an excellent webinar about that through CoCreate Humanity, really interesting. And then complex PTSD, not just PTSD, and then the vicarious trauma. So there's many faces to trauma. So we need to become informed about all of this, really, if we're working in this sector. And then, sorry, I'm just going to move you around a little bit. This is an article I wrote of 12 years of trauma. I won't go into that now, I'll give you a reference to that, but it shows all the kind of different incidents that we've been involved with and how we've managed those. But one interesting thing that we're looking at the moment is there's a lot of organisations have things in place to support staff when there's been a big one-off major trauma event. So for example, the Beirut explosion, but not necessarily the same type of support in place for these longevity, these ongoing traumas. So we're supporting a lot of staff at the moment in Myanmar and the circumstances out there, or even with the pandemic, because we need to take a different approach in how we support people through the longevity of trauma, the ongoing trauma, compared to a big one-off event trauma. And this slide I did actually show in my last webinar with you, but I thought I would show it again because these are, so for the last couple of years, this is what FD consultants, the kind of traumatic events that we've been dealing with, this is staff within the sector. So we can see that actually the largest cases were of sexual violence. This is to do with type of incident, not number of people, because obviously if we look at pandemics, then we're dealing with a lot more people. So if we're talking about numbers of people, the chart might be slightly the other way around, but this is to do with the types of incidents that are coming in. So the most are through sexual violence, death of a member of staff, civil unrest, assault, transport accidents, terrorist attacks, and then the pandemics, and then natural disasters and some other. Okay, let me just take on. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about what is trauma. But not from a neuroscientist physiological point of view, because we've covered that quite a lot in previous webinars, not from kind of defining it, from personal story point of view. And then I'm actually going to read out a poem that I wrote when I had PTSD, to give you a feel, a flavour, a taste of trauma. So I'm so tired and I cannot sleep as the fears all surface and drag me in deep. The darkness and anguish hit me between the eyes, all those memories I desperately try to deny. His dark shadow follows me around all day, those thoughts of despair I can't shake away. I want to be able to draw the curtains on this fear, crack the shell of isolation and let everyone hear. I want to cry as tears swell and then subside, to vanish into the depths deep inside. Total despair and confusion, total frustration and false illusion. Everyone becomes an enemy within. The line they walk becomes so thin. One word spoken out of place and I retreat again in haste. Unable to cope, my surface is fine. People keep telling me it's going to take time. The picture of me is shattered and faded. My personality plundered and raided. My strength is slowly becoming drained. My faith in humanity and justice strained. My confidence has been lost and crushed. And the saddest thing is I've lost all my trust. I feel torn in two, ripped apart, all the hope and love squeezed out of my heart. My passion for life seems to have gone. I feel so low, but must continue to go on. But eventually the lows will hit less often and the pain of life will begin to soften. So it gives you a kind of personal account of what we feel when we're experiencing trauma and PTSD. And other clients have said to me, I feel shattered in tiny pieces. So when we talk about trauma, we often talk about, you know, sometimes even post-traumatic growth can be described, and we'll come to that, but you know, it's sometimes described as this vase that's broken. The post-traumatic stress disorder is the vase that's broken and shattered into pieces. And then the post-traumatic growth is about how we put that back together again, and we can rebuild ourselves more resilient and stronger because we come through something so difficult that we know that we can survive it. So often people describe themselves as shattered or fragmented, broken into pieces. I feel like I'm going mad. That's another thing clients often say to me, because there's such a huge array of symptoms with trauma that impact us psychologically, physically, and spiritually. So people feel like they're going mad. So actually, there's different views around whether people want to be labeled with disorders, but actually from my own personal story, when I found out what I was experiencing was post-traumatic stress disorder, it really helped me because I could understand it better. I've been invaded in every possible way. I hate everything about myself, you know, and I mentioned in the poem, the enemy within. Sometimes people explain it as this enemy within. It's almost like we're fighting ourselves. There's this internal fight that goes on within ourselves. And I'm to blame. I feel to blame. I should have known better. You know, that's another common symptom of trauma, where people feel that they've done something wrong. There's something bad about them rather than the actual situation. So this is giving you a taste of trauma from a different perspective, perhaps, of the other webinars, from a much more personal perspective. And then let's look at some of the processing, some of the ways to treat PTSD. So these are I'm sharing these because these are the approaches that I use in my practice and get excellent results as a therapist. So I mentioned eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It was created in the 80s. So in a way, by having the label PTSD in the 80s and adding that to the diagnostic mental health disorders manual, it helped to get understanding, and it helped to get research, and it helped to get funding. And through that, eye movement desensitization was created, and it was created to help veterans from the Vietnam War, really complex cases of PTSD that weren't getting better, and it was showing to get excellent results. And actually now it's used for phobias, anxiety, depression. It's used in lots of different types of therapy. But the difference with EMDR is that it gets results very quickly. It's a very intensive therapy, and it uses bilateral stimulation. So I'll talk a little bit more about that because we'll go into a couple of case studies. And we do not necessarily, the client doesn't necessarily have to disclose their trauma in detail. They don't have to talk about it in detail, which is why it can work quite well globally. And then the other one I've mentioned there is trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and that's all around reframing our thinking and having tools to manage the trauma. And then another two approaches that I use within my work, and sometimes I combine these, is focusing and parts work. So we talked about how someone can feel fragmented and broken. So sometimes it's quite useful to identify all these different parts of ourselves and how they communicate with one another, and then bringing them in together to work in unison, to support us rather than against us, rather than that fight within, that we get every part to work for us. And focusing is by Glendlin, and it's based on visualization. So because we know with trauma as well, it's very much held in the body. You know, you've got the books, The Body Keeps the Score, The Body Remembers, these classics in trauma. So often people come to me and they describe their trauma in very strong somatic sensation. Like, I have this lump in my throat, or I have this shock wave that goes across my back, or I have this churning in my tummy. And so the visualization is really exploring that. We go into a visualization around that somatic sensation. And because what we tend to do is try and suppress it, try and avoid it, do everything to push it back down. But actually, if we explore it in that way, then we might be able to change that and release it and find a better understanding around why it's there. And then creative narrative. So there's a narrative exposure therapy, is often used with refugees and asylum seekers as well. I kind of like to call it creative narrative therapy, because I do, you know, my previous career before I started working in trauma counselling was actually in advertising. I was a graphic designer, and I like to bring in lots of creativity in my work, and that's expression through music, writing, imagery. So that, and you know, and because things, not only does the person feel fragmented, but sometimes their story feels fragmented, and there might be big chunks that are missing. And actually, sometimes just to write your timeline down and start to put almost the jigsaw puzzles back into the bigger picture helps us to create that narrative. And we know that by doing that, it can help do the processing in the brain, where because generally trauma gets stuck in that amygdala, the fire alarm, and we want to get it into the hippocampus, our memory system, and it puts a date stamp on it and it puts it in the past, and that stops it triggering us and feeling like we're right back in that trauma in the present moment. So these are just some of the approaches that I use, and I'm very happy to answer questions about this in the second part of the webinar as well. So I'm just touching on them today, but we can go into them in more detail. So I'd like to just share some client stories. So these are a combination of client stories, and I've taken out all identifying information. So just an example of working with EMDR. So this is a humanitarian worker who was sexually abused by a co-worker, and the organizational response and investigation actually became very re-traumatizing. And what I find is that sometimes when people come to me for trauma therapy, it's not always the incident they're working on, it's actually how they were treated and supported afterwards. And that immediate support after a traumatic incident is vital in someone's recovery, in how well they recover and how quickly they recover. So to be honest, this story that this isn't just one story. I've had lots of people in the sector coming to me with this scenario. This happens. Okay, so I just get my notes. So basically with EMDR, with the other thing that we notice is that when someone comes for trauma counselling, it may also trigger previous historical traumas. So, they might have had a major event like the Beirut explosion, but actually there's unprocessed traumas in someone's life, and it will bring all of those to the surface, because there does seem to be this thread that takes us through traumatic events. Yeah. And so we're not just working with that one incident, we're working with other incidents, but actually by working on one incident, it has an impact of recovery on others, because it has that thread, that chain throughout those incidents, and the way we think about ourselves, the way we treat ourselves. And like I say, so you don't have to explain the traumatic incident in great detail when we're using EMDR. And we know that within the organization, sometimes these investigations and the way people are treated can be very re-traumatizing. And that a lot of people, as I mentioned before, with trauma may blame themselves anyway. So then if they're not being supported well, it's hard for them to fight for their rights through that, because they're blaming themselves. So it's hard to feel empowered and have that energy to do that, to fight the system just to get the support that you're entitled to. So it's kind of a double whammy in a way. Yeah, so the EMDR will challenge those. We use the bilateral stimulation. So that could be through hand movements. So someone might be talking through their trauma, watching a therapist move their hand left to right. They might be holding buzzers. They might be listening to sounds. And what neuroscientists have shown is that it's moving that information away from that fire alarm system of the brain, where we get reactivated and re-traumatized and we think it's still happening, and into the hippocampus, the part of our filing system that's about memory memory and it places it in the past. So that bilateral stimulation is what's helping set that new neuro pathway and process the information so that we're not going to be as triggered. And, you know, with one-off events, we can probably work through that in about 6 sessions. I think with this particular client, we worked through this in 12 sessions. So it works it's very powerful, and it works very successfully. So trauma-focused CBT. So that I might use that. I might not use EMDR if someone's still in an unsafe environment. So that longevity, that ongoing trauma, because it's an intensive therapy. Really, we do a very thorough assessment, and we wouldn't possibly choose to do EMDR if someone's still going to be activated into their trauma response and stress response because of the environment they're in, if they're already living in a fragile state. So then we might do trauma-focused CBT, which may focus on a lot of stabilization and resourcing and challenging that cognitive thinking. So here I've got a humanitarian aid worker based in Lebanon who was injured in the Beirut explosion, and they lost a close family member in that explosion. So in a way, all trauma therapy uses the power of the imagination, because we know when we activate that part of the brain, it does the opposite of what stress, anxiety, and trauma does. And so there's various techniques we use with trauma-focused CBT, where someone might be imagining the incident in a television and they have the remote control and they're fast forwarding through it, and they stop at the stuck moments and we process those. Or we might look at the beginning of the trauma and the end of the trauma, and then narrow in on the more difficult parts. We might use imagery. We might change the imagery. So we might take the color out and make it a black and white movie. We might take the sound out. So we're taking the intensity of that traumatic experience out, and then we can process it. So it's very powerful, bringing in and using the imagination. And as I mentioned, with traumatic grief, we want to process possibly the shock and the trauma first before we go into processing the bereavement. The process can start to happen. So the other 2 case studies that I wanted to mention, so using focusing and parts work. So this is a humanitarian worker experiencing burnout and flashbacks from previous deployments. So this is the cumulative impact. And what we know is that, you know, if we don't manage vicarious trauma, it can turn into PTSD. If we don't manage stress, it can turn into burnout. Burnout can turn into depression. So, you know, the sooner that we can support people, the sooner it's identified in organizations, the quicker the recovery, because things will become more complex. People will reach out to unhealthy coping strategies like alcohol or overworking or recreational drugs or self-harming behaviors just to suppress the experiences. So this individual had many physical symptoms: migraine, back pain, felt nausea, and she described this strong somatic sensation of a lump in her throat. And so we would do this visualization, and some people might want to close their eyes while we're doing it, like a meditation, and we'd kind of focus on the lump, and then she'd describe it as this hard golf ball, and then we'd follow the breath, and we'd ask what sort of texture, what color, what sensation. So we're making it really tangible as well. And then eventually that took her down into the belly area, and then that connected her to some previous trauma, and then we were able to process that trauma and release it somatically. So it's a sort of safe guided exploration with a professional. And we find that thread between all of these traumas, as I mentioned, so it can lead to processing previous traumas. So creative narrative, so this is a security personnel who witnessed many critical incidents working unsociable hours. He came to counselling suffering from PTSD from the cumulative impact of witnessing years of traumatic events. And so how he would visit art galleries between sessions. That would be his go-to place where he would find comfort and feel resourced. And so what we did is we decided to start talking about some of the images that he would go and see in these art galleries. And within the counselling room, we set up an art gallery and using pictures to describe his experience. And then you could literally see the pictures grow into this story of post-traumatic growth by the end of it. So it's very powerful work. And I love the work of Muli Lahad in Israel. He also kind of uses these kind of picture cards, and you can use imagery to create the narrative and to fill in those gaps. And then enable the brain to process the trauma and calm down the system and reduce the volume of the emotional content of the trauma. So these are just some of gives you a flavor of some of the ways that I work with clients. And this is a quote by Tristan Clements, and his case study is also in the book. And he talks about post-traumatic growth. So looking back, I went through what they would now term post-traumatic growth. There are no magic formula, although psychologists who study such things identify factors that are more likely to increase resilience to unhealthy stress responses. Strong social networks, a robust belief system about the world around you, strong belief in what you are doing as a humanitarian, training, especially stress inoculation training, being in a position to respond to the crisis directly instead of being robbed of agency. But hopefully that part of us can become overall something that can help us grow and not break us down. So that's how he kind of summarized his experience of when he experienced a violent ambush in Darfur. Okay. So I'm going to share my story, and then and we're going to look at lessons learned from these stories, and Helen and Christoph will share their stories. So we'll just keep it very brief, and we'll sum up and look at the lessons learned that have come out of this. So I experienced what psychologists would term developmental trauma. I grew up in a family where my father was violent. I reconnected to my school friends recently and found out that actually this was quite common amongst my peers, but we didn't talk about it at the time. And in fact, we went to great lengths to hide our trauma wounds. You know, it can take so much energy from us to cover that up. And this often included turning to alcohol, partying hard, working hard, anything to drown out the memories or suppress the feelings, which I often see with clients when they first reach out to me. So I was then attacked at university in my early 20s, which resulted in me being knocked unconscious and suffering concussion and a fractured jawbone. I actually went to the aid of someone else that was being attacked, and became the kind of target of that attack. But it wasn't the physical injury that affected me the most. It was actually the mental health injury of post-traumatic stress disorder. Although I didn't know at the time that's what I was suffering from. And I did feel like I was going mad because of this array of symptoms. You know, it's, as I say, it's physical, it's psychological, it's spiritual. And we have that fight within ourselves. And all of that leads to this total exhaustion and this feeling of breaking down, of shattering those parts. So when I came to in an ambulance, I remember the paramedics asking me what my name was, and I couldn't answer them. I didn't know who I was. And that is the weirdest feeling, to not be able to tell anyone who you are. And again, this can be a common shock response. We see these very strong physical reactions. Some people become mute, you know, people can have these very strong reactions to shock. And I remember being asked to have a brain scan, as the medics thought I had a fractured skull. And I was shaking uncontrollably, which is another common trauma response. And I remember the nurse becoming very annoyed with me. She said, look, if you don't stop shaking, this X-ray will not come out. So I remember clinging onto the bars of the hospital bed, desperately trying to keep myself still so that the X-ray would come out. And I now know shaking is a healthy way of releasing trauma in the body, and how helpful and reassuring it would have been if the nurse had been able to tell me that at the time. So when I finally returned home, I became paranoid to leave the house. I was hypervigilant, thinking someone would jump out on me. I couldn't concentrate. I felt jumpy, on edge. I suffered panic attacks. I couldn't sleep. In fact, it took me 3 months before I had my first night's sleep. And I remember it well. I finally drifted off to sleep and was woken with a thud to my head. I felt the full force of being punched in the head from the attack. I heard buzzing like the sound of white noise, and I remember walking around the house trying to work out where this noise was coming from, until it dawned on me that this noise was in my head. So from that moment onwards, I started to get a better night's sleep. So it was almost like my brain was trying to process this event in my sleep. And after a long and drawn out criminal investigation, which again was re-traumatizing at times, the perpetrator was sentenced to time in prison. So in regards to post-traumatic growth and how I've taken that experience from my early 20s to where I am now, I arrived in London working in advertising as a graphic designer, as I said, but I wanted to give back. I wanted to help others through those experiences and, you know, to be able to know what it is they're suffering from, to normalize it, to do the psychoeducation and to help people through the criminal system. So I volunteered with Victim Support. It's a charity that helps people who've been impacted by crime and supported them through the criminal system. And then I went on to train as a therapist, and over time have specialised in trauma, and I've been working in this field for over 15 years. And so at FD Consultants, we focus on those who want to change the world for the better and make sure that they remain resilient to continue to do the great job that they do. That is our focus. So some of the learning that has come out of my story is the need to educate those in the front line work in trauma awareness. It's so important, you know, the medics, whether it's within our own humanitarian sector, with emergency first responders, that there's some really simple things in how someone can be treated immediately after a traumatic event, which will make a huge difference to their recovery and the time in which they recover. The need for organisations to become trauma informed, the need for simple referral pathways to specialist care and collaborative working as well. You know, that we can signpost between different approaches, and the need to understand these specialist trauma approaches and why they work so well, and the need to normalise PTSD. This is a quote that's taken from my book by Turnbull, who works in trauma care. It is not to be described as an illness, it is our ultimate survival response. So if we can reframe PTSD as our ultimate survival response rather than the illness, you know, lots of people use that phrase, don't they? It's a normal reaction to an abnormal event. But to normalize that, and that will change the way that people are supported. So so I think, Helen, did you want to share your story, and then we'll do some learning from that, and then Christoph, if you're okay to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna pass over to Helen.
Thanks a lot, Fiona, for sharing your story. I'm gonna read mine. So my name is Helen. I'm 43 years old and the mother of a 3-year-old little girl. I'm the eldest of 6 children and the daughter of 2 political refugees who arrived in France in 1977 and who survived the genocide in Cambodia. I discovered after I gave birth to my daughter, and also because I was creating CoCreate Humanity, that I was not suffering from epilepsy, but that I have a transgenerational trauma and a PTSD. I have been treated with heavy medication for epilepsy from 1999 until 2019. And what happened to me in 2019? In November 2019, I had the privilege to meet Dr. Daniel Dufour in Geneva. Daniel was a war surgeon, a former ICRC medical coordinator, and he was also one of the descendants of General Guillaume-Henri Dufour, co-founder of the Red Cross. I started the real job when I met him. Dr. Dufour himself suffered from PTSD and he healed. He created a method to help people not to recover, but to heal from PTSD. One of the things I had to do was to unblock my unexperienced emotions, especially my anger, this anger that I kept inside me. I realized the impact of my family story on my everyday life, on my relationships with people, and on my vision of life. War trauma, the unspoken within a family and never mentioned, can generate suffering and violence, sometimes even over even over several generations. Children then become collateral damage from post-traumatic stress disorders from which the elders suffer. I was raised in a daily violence, and I even remember my father's face, who sometimes had tears on his face while beating me. For me, no need to go on the field to face the violence. The violence was under my roof every day, and I felt it in my flesh and in my soul. My life in Lyon, in France, was my field. In 1999, I was sexually assaulted in Lyon, not far from my home place. Almost 1 month after that event, I fell into a 1-week coma. When I woke up, doctors told me that I have epilepsy and that I would have medication for my entire life. I never linked the epilepsy condition to my traumatic event until I met Dr. Dufour, so 20 years later. My family history led me to take an interest in the humanitarian world, particularly the presence of the ICRC and the MSF in the care provided to my parents during their stay at the Thai-Cambodian border. By becoming a humanitarian, I wanted to honor my parents and the humanitarian aid workers who took care of them. I wanted to give something back. And besides, what I learned from my own life experience, because I was homeless for a short time and I had lived in a special home for young girls, I learned that solidarity is the key of everything, that alone you die, and within a community you can survive. And this is why I have co-founded CoCreate Humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Can people hear me? Because I think I just dropped off and came back. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Thank you, Helen. And it takes, it takes huge courage to share our stories. And as we said in the poll, as we saw in the poll at the beginning, every single person here has been impacted by trauma. We all have our own stories, and there's so much learning from those stories, and no shame to talk about our stories. That, it's like, let's share, let's start the conversations, and let's learn, and let's use that in organizations. Because, I go into meetings and we talk about statistics, but behind every single statistic is one person's story, and one person's story matters. And that has a ripple impact to everyone else around us as well. So I'm just going to very, very quick, sorry about this. I seem to have gone back to the beginning. We'll go back to, yeah, thank you, Helen. So yeah, and some of the learning that you talked about there. So, again, the need for medical staff to be trained in identifying PTSD, and it often isn't, and this isn't just in developmental countries. This is globally. It often isn't recognized as PTSD, and then other people can end up with different diagnosis and on medication that may not help them in recovering and processing what's actually happened to them, because we know it's so connected physically, and diabetes too, it has a real impact. Stress has a real impact, doesn't it? And then understanding the many faces of trauma. So as Helen shared there, the intergenerational trauma as well, understanding those and how we would be impacted, and what brings us to work in this sector. That's probably a lot to do with our own stories as well. Why do we want to do what we're doing? And we survive collectively from trauma. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So we are all impacted by one individual story, and one individual story is important enough to make changes. And I feel very passionate about that. And a narrative creates healing. So actually, from all of us who are sharing our stories today, even though we've done a lot of work on ourselves and we've processed these traumas, telling our stories and putting this together, it gave us further insight and further healing in a way, just by putting our stories together for today. One thing I noticed for myself was how actually poetry had really helped me, process my traumas, and I hadn't really connected the two before. So thank you, Helen. And then shall we, Christoph, would you like to share?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Christoph Hensch, and I'm also one of the co-founders of CoCreate Humanity. Now, I want to start my story with something that happened about 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was invited to write an article, a retrospective on an event that happened 20 years earlier. So 20 years earlier, in 1996, I was stationed as a delegate with ICRC in a hospital project in Novy Tagil in northern Chechnya. And one night, one early morning, that hospital installation was attacked. There were people, premeditated, organized raid was carried out on the sleeping facilities of the foreign workers, and with the express, I think, with the express intention to kill as many as possible. So what actually happened was that 6 of my colleagues, they got killed, they got shot. I myself, I also happened to experience somebody entering my room, and I could see that person approaching the middle of the room, pulling out a gun and shooting me and basically leaving me for dead. So that's an event which I talked about often over the years. I retold that story several times from different perspectives to different audiences. However, to go back, what happened 5 years ago, when I was asked to write about this, yes, I could tell what happened to me, but somehow I was left with a feeling of lack of dissatisfaction. I kind of figured, okay, now, okay, there's something missing, really. I think there's really something else that I should be talking about. And after some inner resistance, I realized that what I really needed to talk about was actually not just the initial event that happened, but my whole story of recovery, the whole journey, which over a long period of time really was a second trauma. Yeah, I ended up actually calling it the second trauma, because what happened was that, of course, I left that assignment on an ambulance plane. I returned back to Geneva. I was taken to the hospital, and from then on, I was basically isolated. Well, I went back to my family at home. I recovered, etc. But I was cut off from a lot of the processes that happened after that incident. So there was an official ceremony at the cathedral in Geneva. There were official speeches. There was, a lot of people who got together to talk about this. There were special meetings at the organization to talk about what happened, etc. And I was basically cut off from that. I could not ever participate. And even though my first reaction really was that, yes, what I wanted to do was just getting back to work and take up another mission and so on. And ultimately, about 6 or 7 months later, when I was physically okay again, and there was a mission proposal that was brought back to me to go back to the field, I suddenly realized that, something is not quite right. I couldn't say yes to that mission deployment with the same kind of groundedness as I have said yes to previous mission deployments. And really torn a little bit between feeling the duty of actually doing what I committed myself to do, actually doing what I asked for, another mission deployment. And on one hand, and on the other hand, having this feeling of, okay, something is really not right. Is it really a smart thing to do? I ultimately said to myself, okay, no, I'm going to go back. I'm going back to Switzerland. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I can't, continue the way it was going. And that's the first time. So about 8 months after, between 8 and 9 months after the that initial incident, that I got, that I accepted to go to some psychological support. And interestingly enough, what came out of that psychological support session was really what was sitting with me much deeper than that original incident, was actually the way that I felt treated by my employer at the time, the way that I was cut out from any kind of participatory action, the way that the lack of opportunities to actually sit down with somebody and make sense and find meaning in what happened to me. And so ultimately what my reaction was actually just to separate myself a little bit more, and say, okay, good, that's it. I mean, if they're not interested in me, then why should I be interested in them? I'm gonna leave, and I'm gonna resign, and all of that. And it really and then I kind of drifted from one thing to the other, and it took me 5 years to actually realize that, okay, what is really happening to me is that I have something unfinished in my life, and that all that trauma, and I mean, some PTSD, some not very strong, but still some deep, lack of connection, a lack of being able to take action, a lack of knowing what actually is going on, where I'm going. Basically, I came to the insight that yes, actually, I cannot do anything because I actually haven't finished what happened before. So I never actually finished the previous mission deployment. And so I went back and I said, look, what I would like to do, I would like to go back to the field just for one more mission. I would like to complete the job. I would like to come back at the end. And I would like to have a regular debriefing, and do the way actually it's supposed to happen. And this request was granted, and it was a healing experience. I had to face a lot of the physical and other emotional impacts that I was confronted with, but I managed it. I completed the mission. I went back, I returned, and it was kind of okay. Something actually was concluded finally. So that was 5 years after my initial incident, and then I said, okay, that's it. Let's go. I don't want to. That's it. This part of my life is finished. So, but of course, it wasn't really finished, because it took another 5 years to the next kind of milestones. And it's really, I mean, what this story is all about is there's a number of milestones I went through on my recovery. And the next milestone was the 10-year anniversary of that event, and where I was actually invited to come back to Geneva. And it was 10 years later, the first time I had an audience within ICSC, my employer, among some of the people who were connected to that incident, including the families of those who got killed at that time, to tell my story. And even like just being able to stand up and say, okay, now here I claim that space, I want to tell what happened to me, was such a, it was such a relief somehow. And of course I could only tell that looking back, but it made a huge difference. And then 1 year after that, I was awarded a medal. And a medal, of course, is a piece of public recognition. And so that was 11 years after the incident. I had a feeling that, wow, now I actually have something positive to show. Now I actually don't need to hide it on my CV that I haven't worked for a few years, that I have drifted and tried to heal and so on. Now I have something positive. And it seemed to be like a miracle. Suddenly I was able to hold down jobs. suddenly everything seemed to be much more connected and clear, and so on and so forth. And it took me on a journey where slowly I could actually work myself back into working within the humanitarian field. I had left the humanitarian field to do some other different kind of work, and of course along the way I met a lot of people, a lot of other humanitarians who had similar kind of experiences, and again, a lot of it related to life and the opportunity to work things out with their employers. And so slowly, kind of the idea, grew how that really something needs to be done. So this idea of what we try to implement now with CoCreate Humanity. And it was really only that opportunity of actually writing that article which made me think about, okay, now if I take all my experience and if I come up with some solutions, I can't just come here and complain and so on. Yes, I can tell my story, but there needs to be more. Something positive needs to come out of this. And I was really thinking about, okay, what can we do? What is needed? And I found a kind of a way of looking at this in a more what I call integral way. So, and I've written that up, and I think I hope Fiona, you have referenced my article as well at the end of this webinar. So I understand that yes, people do need objective support. We need to be able to access psychological services. We need to actually be able to access much more than that. There's many more things one can do. There's, you already talked about two ways of dealing with trauma. I've discovered that there is many more different ways, including different forms of art therapy, maybe working with animals, etc., etc. Trauma has happened and has been dealt with throughout human history in many different ways, in many different cultures. So get access to that, get the information, what this is all about. But of course, also I realized that a lot of traumatization that's been already mentioned earlier this evening happens through the way how organizations deal with you after the fact. And so therefore, if you don't look, you don't solve the problem if you don't also look and work with the organizations, the organizational context within that happens, specifically when it comes to procedures and operating standards and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the objective part, but then there's also a subjective part. And the subjective part is, of course, the kind of culture within that all happens, And I think it's been mentioned before as well, having a supportive community that actually has a culture that allows things like trauma, to exist, where we support each other, where we don't marginalize things into the shadows at the edges, but where we can openly talk about those things. Part of it also, of course, is the systemic support. Systems should allow that, but it's also the culture that we then create among ourselves. And of course, I also understand that you can lead a horse to the water, but you cannot force it to drink. That means if the person is not in a situation at a point where they themselves see and decide that they want to engage in those processes, then the other parts they cannot flourish either. So, and basically what I want to say is that the four of those things, the four different aspects, the four different approaches, all of them are needed. And I find myself, I have profited from all of this four, and it's the kind of healing experience I have. I want to help enable others to walk the same path as I have. Voila.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you. And thank you, because you went on to the lessons learned slide. So you've covered the 4 things, and these are actually taken from Christoph's article, and it's a fantastic article and definitely worth a read. And I've got the reference for that in at the end of the presentation slides as well. But so as you see from all of our stories, we've taken those experiences, and these are stories of post-traumatic growth. We want to use these difficult experiences in our lives to make sure that that other people get support and help and understanding quicker than we've had. You know, this, as Christoph's story, you know, is talking about 10 years and more. Helen's also, you know, over a great period of time. And myself, you know, when I experienced PTSD, I was in my early 20s, but I didn't understand it till I was at least in my 30s, you know. So it's kind of, you know, we have shown these experiences of how you can take those difficult challenges and use our learning into how to support others better, and how they have set up CoCreate Humanity, and we've set up FD Consultants, and how we want to work collaboratively to make sure that other people aren't experiencing those secondary traumas that Christoph mentioned. That was my second trauma, the way I was treated by the organization, or the way I was diagnosed incorrectly by, you know, or treated by the medics, you know, whatever that might be. We want to prevent further harm, because that further harm takes us longer to recover from. So I have another story I want to share, which is actually a client of mine who would have been here to present today, but she's in Vietnam and the time differences are quite, you know, in the middle of the night for her. But she's very kindly allowed me to share her story of post-traumatic growth. And so I'm just going to, so this is Denise. She's happy for me to mention her name, and I'm just going to read through. So she works in conservation, and she experienced 2 incidents of sexual assault on 2 different accounts by 2 different colleagues in the field. When she reported this was mishandled by her supervisors and HR, who failed to document, escalate, and properly handle the case. She therefore had to escalate the case to the international office. Now, this is the thing, it's like, how do you find that fight within to continue to find justice, or find the appropriate support that you need, and also to make sure this doesn't happen to other people, other colleagues. And, you know, and you can understand why someone would just leave the sector and feel completely disheartened. But she continued to find the energy to fight this, and that wasn't easy. And there was a lot of experiences that re-traumatized her through this process. So it took a year, and in the meantime, as I mentioned, there was lots of things that were re-traumatizing in the way that she was handled and managed and supported, or lack of support. And she says women face an uphill battle in the field of wildlife conservation. In Vietnam and the greater Mekong region, it is a small minority of women who can pursue careers as scientists. It is common for women to be confronted with abuse, harassment, or assault in the field or in the office. She says, initially I felt strong and that I had healed and got over it, and didn't need or didn't feel I had the time for therapy. But without taking that time to process and internalize it, I would never really be free. I needed to take the time, otherwise I would be stuck in this vicious cycle of minimalizing the incident and burying it until it festered and blew up. Moreover, it was not so much the incident themselves that irritated me anymore, but the failure from my supervisors to do what they should have been done and what was expected of every person in the organization, which was the right thing. The incident itself can hurt, but the lack of acknowledgement and support from peers, family, and colleagues can hurt even more, as I've added the quote on that slide. So some of the lessons that she wanted to share from her story and her story of post-traumatic growth. So the system itself can be re-traumatizing. Absolutely. So organizations might have policies and procedures in place, but they're not necessarily being followed, or people aren't understanding them, or the people that are doing, you know, meant to be there in the safeguarding or supportive perhaps need further support and training. So people are being let down when they come forward, and it's hard enough to come forward. It takes courage. It takes huge courage to come forward and tell your story. So here I've got in brackets one main contact. You know, your story shouldn't be shared around. Lots and lots of people in the organization. Have one main contact that you can go to and feel secure with and safe with, and they can go and find out and fight your cause and find out the information for you. She says, I would recommend a more inclusive approach. not only women, but the indigenous communities and the voiceless flora and fauna that we work for. She said, I would recommend a robust reporting and support system to be well understood and utilised. You can see there's themes coming out of all of our stories, that employees know the definitions of what constitutes sexual harassment or assault in the company policy or in their country's labour law to exercise an advocate for support without reprisal. If we are truly integrated in a future where humans and nature can thrive, where we can advocate for gender equality in this field and integrate safeguards and empowerment through a community-based, rights-based approach to the conservation mission. So she says that what helped her to go to move towards post-traumatic growth is that she the way she would center herself spiritually and physically is that she would take herself into remote wilderness and she would reconnect to nature and truly spent 6 months living in a van during COVID. You know, as Christoph said, there's lots of other ways that we can process our traumas through nature or through creativity. I was able to be away from the toils and troubles of society and civilization in a safe space with the rocks and the trees and the rivers and the canyons and the mountains. But then she went out she did reach out for therapy to process her traumatic events. And again, as similar to Christoph, the way she was treated by her organization was actually what she was focusing on and how it had triggered previous traumas. And so she ends by saying, by looking back at past traumas, I was able to acknowledge them as my growth beacons. I awakened the graceful warrior through an understanding and reckoning within myself that I had the physical capacity, the spiritual capacity, and the mental toolkit to overcome situations like this, should they arise again, and indeed be able to carry the torch for so many women that face systemic repression, needlessly stifling the advancement of our species. So she goes on to help others tell their story through her film work. I have truly emerged from breakdown to breakthrough, like a phoenix that has risen through the ashes. Now I am strong enough that I must help my other fellow women warriors break through and break down these societal and generational traumas that have embedded themselves into our existence. So again, another very powerful story of post-traumatic growth. And she'll be listening into the recording of this. So let's look at post-traumatic growth. There is actually a model. There's research done that shows that this can happen. And there's the reference there. So Tetsi and Kalun talk about 5 factors that help to lead us to post-traumatic growth. So one is to educate ourselves, to find out what's going on, to understand what's happening to us. So that understanding of what is PTSD, what are the symptoms, what does it mean, what's happened here. Then finding ways to emotionally regulate. So that could be through different therapies, it could be through different activities. How do we emotionally regulate? And then disclosure. You know, they've actually found that disclosing and talking about our stories helps. That's why we're sharing our stories today. It's all part of our recovery, and it's all part of healing and helping healing others. And we know it has that ripple impact. And then creating that narrative. As I said, there may be chunks missing. So by telling the story, we're creating the narrative. And then by using our experiences to the service of others. So how do we use our experience to help others? And I think all of our stories that we've shared with you today show some very strong examples of that. And I can, there's lots of references to this as well that you can go on and look at. So I'm just aware of the time. So I think what I might do is I will just move on to a couple of slides and then we'll end and have a break. So just very quickly, these are some of the lessons learned from COVID. The reason I'm sharing this is because actually what organisations seem to be reaching out for more is that trauma and vicarious trauma awareness piece. So we're doing a lot more of those workshops and also supervision support for staff. So these are regular places for staff to go and debrief and share their stories. So that cumulative impact, we're kind of catching it early so that we can signpost people to specialist support, or we can give tools to help people when they're having that cumulative impact. So supervision might be offered for teams of staff that their roles have been identified as high-risk roles. So not just those out on the field. This can be fundraisers, researchers, people in comms and social media, you know, that may be exposed to traumatic material, because we know that vicarious trauma is just as impactful. So these are some of the things that we've been asked to do more of, in a way, because of the pandemic. Peer support is one of those services. We're doing a lot of training for managers, mental health awareness training for managers, helping them, support them, help them understand how to support staff with mental health. You know, there seems to be this real adverse, like, you know, we can talk about physical problems, but we don't want to talk about mental health problems. So we're giving people the tools and the confidence to have those conversations and create these wellbeing action plans. And also, what's the other lessons have come out of COVID is that more flexible way of working that will change organisations moving forward. This is a trauma management programme. You can find much more information about this in my book, but it would be an ideal trauma management programme that organisations would embed into their system. And so it would include that immediate crisis management, the screening, family liaison support, peer support, psychological first aid, debriefing, specialist trauma counsellors, and follow up, because we know about the delayed response to trauma. So I just wanted to read a couple of more quotes out and play a very short video, another poem that I will share with you, and then we'll take a break. So these are some quotes from clients that have come out the other side. So I made it, and literally they call it, I made it out the other side. People sometimes describe it that way. I made it through, I made it out the other side. It's in the past now, I feel separate from it. You know, it may still mark me as a person, but it doesn't affect me in the same way. So, you know, these experiences, they never leave us, but they just don't have the same emotional impact. Trauma changed me from head to toe and inside out. I had to rebuild myself and start again. So we talk about that vase, the shattered vase, and how we rebuild it. And there's something in that rebuilding that can lead us to the post-traumatic growth as well, because by being shattered, we almost have to review everything that we've ever done in our past and how we've coped with things in the past. And we have to assess, actually, is that working for me anymore, that way of coping? And some people go on to really change their lives, you know, move or change career or do something very different, or set up like CoCreate Humanity or FD Consultants. You know, there's a lot that comes out of it. Trauma changed, and I have closure now. Initially, I wanted my old self back, but I realized that was not going to happen. Trauma fundamentally changes you as a person, and I've become more of the person I want to be. So that's kind of what I was just explaining there. So this is, sorry, I'm just going to move. So this is a quote taken from my book, and just a kind of appreciation of all the people that took the courage to share their stories. And I call it the scars of wisdom, because we are scarred, you know, when we've come through this, but these scars can lead to wisdom. So the impact of trauma may leave scars, but if processed, those scars become engraved with understanding and wisdom. That wisdom can be used to help others in their recovery. The whisper of that wisdom comes across in every personal story shared in this book, and hopefully has come through today in the stories that you've heard. So just on our website, fdconsultants.net, there's lots and lots of resources. There's articles, resources, free downloads, podcasts, and links to these webinars and all sorts of other things. And just because, you know, just putting this together actually made me think that I'm going to offer a trauma awareness workshop to individuals, because we do it for the organisations, but not all organisations are offering this to their staff. And we find it very inconsistent, the kind of quality of care within the sector anyway. So I am going to be running a trauma awareness workshop for staff or for individuals who want to become trauma informed, and I'll let CoCreate Humanity know when I set that up as well. So I'm going to play a video, and then we'll stop the recording at the end of the video, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we can come back and we can look at answering some of your questions. So let me just stop sharing this, and I'm going to share, hopefully, something else. Just bear with me. Oh, I know, because I have to shut the PowerPoint down and open this bind. Okay, so I'm going to share this, and then we'll take a break. From the darkness, I walk into the light. From the battle, I no longer have to fight. From my critical stance that I can now bat away. From hiding in the corner, I can now have a say. From constant self-doubt to clear self-belief. From anxious tension to peaceful relief. From rigid constructs to a more fluid way of being. From tunnel vision to an eagle's view at seeing. From living in fear to finding my freedom. From searching blindly to understanding reason. From denying my anger to feeling my passion and power. From new growth to a blossoming flower.